We got this and this one, yep, and there I am. Hello world, my name is Matt Spa, and I'm a photographer and video producer in Atlanta, Georgia. And in this video, I'm going to take a look at the Tamron 20-40 f2.8 zoom lens. We'll go over some technical information, and I'll share some footage and photos I've shot with it, and I'll no doubt gush slightly over the Tamron Lens Utility software that was likely the deciding factor in my purchase of this lens, which for the record I did purchase, and as I have no affiliation whatsoever with Tamron, the opinions I will share in this video are of course entirely my own. If this is your first visit to my channel, welcome. I'm into all things audio, video, and photo related. If you share a common interest, I hope you'll consider subscribing. When I first saw this lens announced, it piqued my interest, but it was a bit of a tough sell for me. I love my Zeiss 16-35 f4, and if you've seen my video about why I didn't buy the Tamron the 17-28, you already know why. It's a great zoom range, and I like the color and the contrast that comes from Zeiss glass. The autofocus is superb, and it has optical stabilization built in. So the big question for me became, is it worth $700 US to steal 4mm from the wide end, gain 5mm on the long end, to get an extra stop of light, but then to lose the in-body stabilization? And honestly, those things alone might not have been enough. What pushed me over the edge was this magical little USB-C port on the side and the incredible flexibility that it adds to this lens. More on that later. The Tamron 20-40 f2.8 lens is made to cover full-frame sensors and has a minimum aperture of f22. It has 9 aperture blades, which give a very pleasing bokeh, or bouquet if you're prone to mispronunciation. It's particularly rounded once you get to f5.6 or so, if you're into that kind of thing. Minimum focus distance is 6.7 inches at 20mm and a little bit further at 40mm. It weighs 365 grams, which is 0.8 of a pound in places where pounds are not currency. It's a mere 3.4 inches long, which is 86mm in countries that measure distances in kilometers but speed in miles per hour for some reason. The filter thread is 67mm, which fits in with many of Tamron's current offerings, and it comes with a dandy lens hood. It has no internal stabilization, which, while I've always touted that as a big benefit of the 16-35, it's becoming less of a selling point for me. My cameras have in-body stabilization, and the most recent Sony cameras have 2 levels of stabilization, standard and active. Active stabilization does eat up a slight crop, but in my experience, it provides a better level of stabilization than what can be obtained with any of my stabilized lenses. I ordered my 20-40 pretty soon after it became available, and I've used it a lot. I've used it for locked off shots, I've used it for handheld shooting, and extensively for gimbal work on my Ronin RS3 Pro. I feel like I've lived with it long enough to express some pretty solid opinions, and spoiler alert, it's awesome. I recently had a 4-day shoot at a medical facility, and the 20-40 was my primary gimbal lens for all 4 days. I think it was actually probably the only gimbal lens that I used. I was at 24mm a lot of the time, but I did use the entire focal range, and I never really found myself feeling like I was limited. In super cramped quarters, a 16mm would have yielded a wider field of view, of course, but the trade-off in distortion at the edges of the frame would have been an issue. For my eyes and for my work, 20mm on a full-frame sensor is about the max that I can go when I need things to look natural. As mentioned, it is a full stop faster than my 16-35, and it's considerably lighter and smaller. In terms of optical performance, in my opinion, it's fantastic with regard to sharpness, contrast, and color rendering. There's no shortage of pixel peeper videos out there that you can watch to get a more fleshed out opinion if any one of those categories could be a deal breaker for you. I watched Dustin Abbott and Gerald Undone and a number of other videos on it, and my summation kind of those videos backed up with my personal experience is that this lens gets really high marks in terms of sharpness across the entire frame and throughout the entire focal range. Being a fan of the color rendering I get from my Zeiss primes, I personally find the Tamron to be a bit less saturated, but minor tweaking in Capture One or Final Cut or whatever you use yields pretty much indistinguishable results between the two. There are two things, in my opinion, that make this lens a real standout. One is the focal range. As much as I love my 16 to 35, the only times I find myself in that 16 to 20 range is when I'm getting really close to drastically exaggerate something in the frame, or if I'm shooting architectural interiors, which for me just isn't very often. What I do often find with that lens is that I want more reach. Even with the ability to punch into a Super 35 sensor crop, the extra reach on the long end of this lens makes me really happy. This lens does display some focus breathing, but I think it's a reasonable amount for something in this size and price range. I don't personally find it distracting, but I know the threshold for that is different for everyone. Autofocus is responsive and accurate and practically silent. I don't think I've ever heard a motor sound come out of this thing. Making adjustments in camera for autofocus sensitivity and speed yielded predictable results consistently. But the thing that made me just really get excited about this lens and order it was the Tamron Lens Utility. If you saw that chocolate-fueled fiasco of a video that I made about the Sony 90mm macro, which it's here and there, you know how much I detest focus-by-wire lenses. The Lens Utility allows you incredible control over how your focus ring functions. Using the software, you can set the focus ring to what suits you best. Linear performance, of course, in my case, or focus-by-wire if you're just a Yahoo. And you can select how sensitive you want the ring to be by setting the focus throw to either like a short or long throw. In a video setup where I'm manually pulling focus, I often want the extra control and precision of a long throw. For walk-around shooting, run and gun, or handheld B-roll, that shorter throw is perfect. The implementation of all this technology is really refreshing too. The USB-C port is built right into the lens. There's no dock to buy or keep up with, and there's no weird cable to keep track of. It's simple, and I like that. Downloading the software and the process of getting it up and running was very intuitive, at least for me, and for some reason sometimes I stumble around on that stuff. You can also use it to make firmware updates really quickly. There's no downloading a file and putting it on an SD card and getting a bunch of cryptic warning messages and not really knowing what you're doing. It's not the prettiest interface I've ever seen, but it's easy to navigate, and most importantly, it works like it's supposed to, and you don't come away going, well, I hope that worked. One thing I would like to see is probably some protection, maybe for that USB port. I rarely shoot in hazardous locations, but I can see how leaving that port unprotected could create problems for certain users. The other thing that might be a negative for some is that the zoom is external, so it's not internal to the lens. If you're using this on a gimbal, which it's really, really good for, you may need to rebalance your payload. On my RS3 Pro, I just set the lens to roughly the center of the focal length range when I'm doing my initial balancing. I've never had to rebalance when zooming in or out. I guess your gimbal is ultimately going to determine whether or not rebalancing is necessary as you change your focal length. So was it worth $7 to get the extra reach and the additional stop of light, even at the expense of lens stabilization and a little bit on the wide end? In my case, yes. This lens is unique in my experience, and it strikes a really good balance of features and usability and just great quality images. It really is a fantastic piece of glass. I hope the information I've shared about the Tamron 20-40 f2.8 was helpful to anyone considering this lens, and I thank you very much for watching.